Under the glitz of an elite gala, Black Janitor, accused of stealing a diamond ring, found himself trapped in accusations he never saw coming. But unaware, Big Shaq is watching, and the truth he uncovered changes everything. In a room full of whispers and suspicion, one silent observer begins to unravel a lie, too cruel to stay buried. When Big Shaq steps forward, this isn't just a theft, it's the moment injustice meets reckoning. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The grand ballroom of Hawthorne Crest Academy shimmered under crystal chandeliers, each beam of light dancing across polished parquet flooring. It was the night of the annual charity gala, an evening of lavishness and prestige. The Academy's elite mingled in tailored suits and silk gowns, voices echoing in polished tones, and champagne flutes jingled in anticipation. The purpose was noble, to raise funds for student scholarship. What no one suspected, under the veneer of grace, was the gathering storm that had gathered just beyond their polished smiles. Clarence Miles, the school's janitor, moved quietly through the crowd. It was a night he should have observed from the sidelines, an evening off, a respite after months of early mornings and late nights, keeping the campus spotless. But Hawthorne Crest's gala was his greatest pride. He was known by every student and teacher, a gentle presence with a ready nod and a steady hand, mopping floors before dawn and sweeping leaves after dusk. That night, he simply wanted to watch, to smile at old faces, and witness the school's grandeur. He wore his modest suit, well-pressed but humble, his posture erect, his eyes warm. A hush fell across the hall as the headmistress took the stage. She was to present a surprise guest speaker, Shaquille "Big Shaq" O'Neal. Clarence had heard rumors. A towering basketball legend, a man of empathy and stature, noted for his charity and compassion. When Shaq stepped into view, a giant among men, gasps of awe swept through the crowd. With calm charisma, Shaq began speaking of dreams, of justice, of gratitude. His voice emerged like a firm, silent drum. Clarence watched from the back, feeling pride in his school and gratitude for Shaq's message. Yet, amid the warmth, the ice cracked. A young heiress, Helena Whitcomb, discovered her heirloom diamond ring missing. Panic rippled. The priceless emerald-set ring lay missing from her finger, vanished from its velvet cushion at the silent auction table. Gasps turned to murmurs. Concern hardened into accusation. Whispers swirled through the gala. Red flags raised. Security staff began discreet questioning. The elegant charm of the evening twisted, unraveling into suspicion. And soon the blame shifted, cruelly and swiftly, toward Clarence Miles. The fact that he was black and wore a modest suit made him an instant figure of suspicion. A teacher, uncertain but anxious, had noticed him nearby moments earlier. Security guards quietly patted him down behind closed doors. More than one wealthy parent nodded approvingly. The rumor spread like wildfire, whose very crackle silenced polite conversation. Clarence, shocked and dismayed, felt the weight of every eye. He had walked past Helena's table once, bowing slightly in respect. He had smiled at students who waved in greeting. Now the smiles vanished, replaced by nervous glances. The warmth he once felt as part of the school community frayed at the edges. And with every step he took, he sensed judgment. But he remained composed, head high, believing in clarity. The ring had vanished, but so had his peace. Unbeknownst to all, Big Shaq had noticed. The NBA champion turned philanthropist observed the proceedings with silent intensity. He saw Clarence's respectful nod, caught the guard's furtive frisk, and traced the growing circle of suspicion around the janitor like water slipping into the ground. Shaq's heart tightened. Beneath polished speech and staged charity, injustice had crept in. A man named Clarence was being accused, a fixture of this academy, without evidence or malice, just proximity. As the gala continued, Shaq's speech faltered. He paused, glanced at the hesitant security guards surrounding Clarence, and registered the swelling tension. Yet, for now, the ring remained lost. The rumor hung heavy, and the night progressed under a mask of normalcy. The chandelier lights of Hawthorne Crest Academy gleamed on, but behind them, shadows gathered, souls about to be tested. And at the center stood a gentle man, wrongly accused, unaware that one man in the crowd was already planning to stand for truth. The gala would close in applause and champagne. The rumor would fester, and Clarence would return to empty floors and hollow stares. But somewhere in those glimmering beams, Big Shaq made a vow. He would watch, He would listen, and he would act. Suspense held the room, the world shifted on its axis, and the first page of this story was written in silence and resolve. The story will move forward without repeating scenes, and it will be exactly 14. Clarence Miles lived in a quiet brick house on the corner of Brookvale and Roseview, a modest neighborhood carved from the fringe of prosperity. It was the kind of place where the street lamps buzzed faintly after sunset, where lawns were cut just enough to pass the eye test, and where small dreams unfolded without headlines. His home, aged but cared for, held the scent of time wood polish, lemon detergent, and the faint musk of weathered books. A faded family photo sat on the mantel. His late wife, Evelyn, smiled forever in a frame that had not been moved in 12 years. Her presence still lingered in every stitch of the curtains she once sewed, in every plate Clarence dried and set gently into the cupboard. Raising his grandson, Trevin, had become Clarence's purpose in the years since Evelyn's passing. The boy was 10 now, sharp-eyed, curious, with a silent resilience that mirrored his grandfather's. Their morning started with oatmeal, bananas split down the center, and gospel humming from a dusty old radio. Clarence would lace up his old work boots, pack Trevin's lunch, and head out before sunrise. By the time the school bell rang, Clarence was already pushing the mop down the front steps of Hawthorne Crest Academy, the scent of lemon wax trailing behind him like a familiar echo. His life was one of routine, but not of emptiness. He found quiet meaning in keeping things clean, in order, in rhythm. He never asked for much. He greeted every student with a gentle nod, remembering birthdays, offering an umbrella on rainy days, and lifting heavy boxes for teachers with a smile. Over the years he had become an unspoken part of the school's foundation, the man who knew every corridor and creaky stair, yet the truth of Clarence's soul, his wounds and wisdom remained known only to a few. Decades ago, Clarence had marched in protests that never made the evening news. He had faced locked doors and lowered eyes when he applied for jobs. He had held his breath through stops by officers who never gave reasons. And once he'd been denied a loan at a bank where he'd deposited his paycheck for 20 years. But through it all, Clarence never allowed the world to twist him bitter. Instead, he taught himself forgiveness, not because the world deserved it, but because his heart could not survive on anger alone. He buried the pain and pressed forward, carrying dignity like a candle through darkness. So when the rumor of the missing diamond ring spread through the walls of Hawthorne Crest, Clarence felt the chill long before the words reached him. The way students avoided eye contact in the hallway, the staff room door that paused before closing fully when he walked by, the security guard who lingered longer than usual near his cleaning cart, and then came the moment, the one that stripped the breath from his lungs. He was called to the administrative office, where he was asked to empty his pockets and open his locker. He stood quietly, stunned but calm, knowing this was not a misunderstanding. It was a pattern he had lived through before. From afar, Shaquille O'Neal watched. He had stayed after the gala, opting to walk the school grounds, to feel the pulse of the place beyond applause. As he strolled past the trophy cases and honor boards, he overheard raised voices down the hall. He followed quietly, and what he saw struck something deep within him. Clarence, surrounded by school officials, held his hands open, his eyes filled not with fear, but with fatigue. The scene was painful not because of drama, but because of its familiarity. Shaq had known this look, this posture, the resignation of a man who had tasted injustice before and knew its flavor too well. But then something unusual happened. As Clarence stepped away from his locker, Shaq noticed a boy, one of the upper-grade students, freeze mid-step at the end of the hall. His name was Colton Fairview, son of a powerful developer, and heir to a legacy soaked in old money. Colton didn't know Shaq saw him, but what the former athlete observed was subtle and telling. Colton's eyes flicked not to Clarence, but to the administrator's desk drawer. His jaw clenched for a fraction of a second, and his posture faltered, just enough to raise suspicion. Then he vanished down the hall, his steps quickening. Shaq didn't react, not yet. He simply stood, half hidden by the hallway shadows, processing everything, the injustice Clarence endured in silence, the glimmer of guilt in Colton's hesitation, and the disturbing ease with which everyone had aligned against the janitor without hesitation or proof. It was the kind of moment that reshaped memories. Shaq recalled his own youth, when teachers would eye him as a threat before knowing his name, when assumptions clung to him like shadow, and how he'd vowed to never let injustice unfold in front of him unanswered. Clarence returned home late that night, silent through dinner. Trevin sensed something was wrong, but didn't ask. He simply sat beside his grandfather, knees pulled to his chest, watching cartoons with the volume low. Clarence stared at the screen, but saw nothing. The humiliation of the search, the weight of silent accusations, wrapped around him like smoke. He didn't weep. He hadn't cried since Evelyn's funeral. But he felt hollowed out. His heart pulsed heavy, his breath slow, his faith bruised. In the days that followed, Clarence's world grew quieter. His routine continued. But eyes followed him differently now. Where once there were waves and greetings, now there was silence and suspicion. The school did not fire him, but they suspended him for observation, while the investigation continued. He left the premises with a small box of belongings and the echo of whispers he had never earned. Yet something had shifted. Because Shaq, far from idle, had begun his own quiet watch. He requested access to visitor footage from the gala, citing a speech review. He began calling staff under the guise of mentorship, and behind each polite conversation, he listened for tremors, slips of truth hidden in casual tones. He didn't confront, not yet. He observed, calculated, and began connecting dots. Each thread led back not to Clarence, but to something far more tangled. Clarence, unaware of the watchful eyes in his defense, returned home to a mailbox filled with community newsletters and a phone that had stopped ringing. He took long walks in the evening, hands tucked behind his back, thinking not of the ring, but of legacy. What story would his grandson inherit from this moment? Would it be one of silence or one of standing tall in the face of slander? On one such walk, a note fluttered across his path. Pink, folded, dropped from a backpack ahead. He picked it up and read the message hastily scrawled in pencil. I know it wasn't Mr. Miles. I saw something. No name. Just trembling handwriting. He looked around, but the hallway was empty. He folded the note gently and tucked it into his breast pocket. In the solitude of his front porch, beneath the soft creak of his rocking chair, Clarence held that note in his palm, like a lifeline. Somewhere in the maze of assumptions and whispers, truth still stirred. And unbeknownst to him, someone powerful had already begun pulling back the veil. Shaq had seen the hesitation, felt the weight of injustice, and now he moved with the quiet urgency of a man who understood both the cost of silence and the necessity of action. As night settled over Clarence's home, and Trevin slept soundly in his room, the world outside turned colder. But inside, despite all, a flicker remained. Not just hope, but the quiet, unyielding promise that truth, no matter how buried, would find its way back into the light. Judgment moved faster than fact. In the corridors of Hawthorne Crest Academy, truth was no longer something to be sought. It was something people assumed they already possessed. By Monday morning, the school had grown colder. The glossy banners that once billowed above the hallways now hung like accusations. Clarence Miles' name was spoken only in hushed tones, never with clarity, just caution. His locker was sealed with official tape. His office, once filled with supplies and daily checklists, had been stripped to a sterile silence. Even his nameplate, polished every week by his own hand, had been quietly removed. The headmistress released a carefully worded statement to the faculty. It spoke of ongoing investigations, cooperation with authorities, and a temporary leave of absence for Mr. Miles. But the words that weren't said, guilt, suspicion, betrayal, echoed louder through the walls. Teachers whispered in between lessons. Some students were told not to speak about the incident, though they already had. Whispers climbed like vines up the stone walls of the school's legacy. Clarence's name, once met with smiles and gratitude, now carried a question mark. Clarence himself stayed home. The suspension letter arrived without ceremony, printed in sterile font, dropped through his mailbox with no knock. The phrasing was cold. Pending investigation. Mr. Miles is relieved of duties. Effective immediately. No apology. No inquiry. Just a signature and a door closed quietly on a man who had never asked for recognition, but always delivered respect. Outside his home, the street grew unfamiliar. Two men in plain clothes parked across from his porch for 3 afternoons in a row, pretending to check their phones. A woman walking her dog paused too long near his mailbox. The mailman stopped saying hello. None of it was direct, none of it violent. But Clarence knew the feeling when a neighborhood smiles with its mouth, but watches with narrowed eyes. He kept his head down, continued making Trevin's lunch every morning, and reminded the boy to stand tall at school, even when the world didn't look him in the eye. Inside Hawthorne Crest, the staff room divided itself into unspoken factions. Some believed Clarence innocent, but feared speaking out. Others clung to the logic of proximity. He was near the ring. He must have had motive. Why else would security question him? Assumptions bloomed in silence, watered by pride and the fear of being wrong. And while Clarence sat at home under suspicion, no one asked who else might have had access to that ring. No one questioned the sudden flicker of the hallway camera. No one paused to consider the truth outside the convenience of assumption. But one man did. Shaquille O'Neal hadn't left town. He had cancelled a planned interview, citing personal reasons, and booked a quiet room at a nearby boutique hotel. Officially, he was unavailable. Unofficially, he was gathering. He reviewed the layout of the gala room, the security positions, the auction table's timeline, and began a quiet audit of everything that had slipped through the cracks. Where others saw an open and shut case, Shaq saw open doors. He began with the camera logs. The school, under pressure to cooperate, provided footage for the hour before and after the ring went missing. Shaq watched silently. He studied faces, not just expressions but patterns. Students moved with purpose. Staff hovered in predictable loops. Clarence, he noted, followed his regular cleaning rhythm. No stutters, no deviation. But then came a subtle anomaly. Two students, Colton Fairview and Blake Harrow, lingered near the auction table longer than necessary. They spoke, gestured, then parted. Moments later, Helena's ring was gone. What struck Shaq wasn't just their proximity, but Colton's earlier hesitation in the hallway. The connection was thin, but enough to stoke a fire of suspicion. He requested background on both students. Colton was the son of property tycoon Jackson Fairview, a major donor to the school. Blake Harrow's father ran the local district's school board. Together they formed a pair untouchable by most. But Shaq didn't move recklessly. He knew power had a shape, and in this town it wore legacy like armor. Instead, he made quiet calls. He spoke to a former janitor, long retired, who'd worked at Hawthorne Crest before Clarence. The man recalled another theft 5 years back, small, hushed up, involving a missing brooch during a parents' luncheon. No charges filed, no name released. Shaq filed it away. He visited the gala venue and walked the perimeter. He noticed something no one else had. The silent auction table sat beneath a mounted camera, one that had stopped recording precisely 6 minutes before the theft was reported. Power outage? No. Manual override. Someone had known exactly when to make a move. Outside the school gates, Clarence's world grew narrower. Trevin came home quieter. He'd been pulled aside in the hallway by students repeating things their parents had whispered. "Your grandpa's a thief. Is he going to jail?" Children mimicked the cruelty they didn't yet understand. Clarence told Trevin the same thing every night. Stand in the light, even if you're alone in it. But it was harder now. His back hurt more. His food tasted less. And when he looked in the mirror, he saw not shame but sorrow for a world so quick to erase trust. Shaq began watching the two boys, Colton and Blake, from afar. He sat in a borrowed SUV outside Blake's upscale home. He watched Colton arrive at the school in his polished SUV, greeted like royalty. One afternoon he saw Blake slip a black pouch into a teacher's drawer after class, then pull it out moments later when no one reacted. A test. A game. Shaq's gut tightened. These weren't just boys with bad intentions. They were playing with perception, knowing the rules bent around their bloodlines. Then came a break. One of the kitchen staff, Miss Geneva, reached out discreetly. She'd been present during the gala and overheard part of a conversation between the two boys. A stupid bet, just a prank. He won't even fight back. She hadn't understood it then. But when Clarence was suspended, she couldn't shake the memory. Shaq met her in a corner booth, at a diner 20 miles from town. She trembled while speaking, afraid of losing her job. Shaq assured her calmly, gently. No pressure, just her account aligned perfectly with the timeline he'd begun assembling. And so the pattern sharpened. The theft wasn't impulsive. It was orchestrated. A joke among the privileged, designed for cruelty, cloaked in anonymity. Clarence had simply been chosen, not for any flaw, but because he was invisible in the eyes of power. He was easy to blame, and unlikely to be defended. Yet Shaq had seen him, from the beginning. At night Shaq sat in his room, files spread out, notes scrawled in shorthand. He didn't need permission to act. What he needed was precision. One mistake, one public accusation without proof, could derail everything. The Fairviews and Harrows of the world didn't fight fair, but Shaq had something they didn't: clarity of purpose and nothing to lose. He wasn't interested in punishment. He was interested in exposure. Not just for Clarence's vindication, but for everyone who had chosen silence when they could have spoken up. He drafted a plan, not a confrontation, a reveal, one that would trap the lies without alerting the liars. He began collecting statements, cross-referencing footage, quietly building a web of truths the school could no longer ignore. It wasn't rage that fueled him. It was memory of every time he'd been seen as a threat, not a man, of every friend denied a chance because of color, not character. Clarence was just the latest casualty in a war fought in whispers. Back at Clarence's house, things remained quiet. He tended to his garden. He helped Trevin with homework. He waited. He didn't know Shaq was working. He didn't know how close the walls of assumption were to crumbling. He simply held on to his dignity, as he always had, quietly, without ceremony. But the town had missed something crucial. They had forgotten that power does not always roar. Sometimes it watches, sometimes it waits, and sometimes it moves without warning. Big Shaq wasn't done watching. He was only just beginning. Shaquille O'Neal had always understood the power of presence. He could command a room with a single step, but in this chapter of his life, silence served him better than stature. After witnessing the quiet unraveling of Clarence Miles' reputation, Shaq did not storm into Hawthorne Crest with accusations or fanfare. Instead, he slipped into the role that few expected of him. An observer cloaked in calm, sifting through layers that others didn't even know existed. Where others saw an open and shut case, Shaq saw a murky undercurrent. The first string he pulled was quiet, but significant. He reached out to Lenny Brooks, an old friend from his time with law enforcement outreach programs. Lenny now worked with digital surveillance consulting for educational institutions. With a brief call, Shaq secured access to security footage beyond what the school had willingly provided. His request was framed as part of a charity audit, a cross-check for media purposes. But what he really wanted was time, uninterrupted hours to study angles, movement, and behavior in the moments before the ring went missing. He began by mapping the floor plan of the gala, comparing foot traffic patterns, and noting every guest who passed near the auction table. The first red flag came within minutes. Blake Harrow, the district superintendent's son, made 3 separate laps past the table in a span of 5 minutes. On each pass he paused, not for conversation, not to bid, but to glance back. Shaq slowed the footage down, frame by frame. On the third pass, Blake adjusted a cufflink with a conspicuously deliberate movement, his fingers dipping into his jacket pocket. Helena Whitcomb's ring was still in its display case at that moment. Minutes later, the camera in that hallway glitched. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. While the school clung to its narrative of circumstantial suspicion, Shaq started expanding his reach. He called in a favor with a retired tech consultant who specialized in internal data breaches. Together they analyzed the camera outage. The interruption hadn't been due to a power surge or system malfunction. It had been manually triggered from a staff-level access point, a remote system located behind the administrative offices. That meant someone with higher clearance had temporarily disabled the feed. Clarence, a janitor, had no access to such systems. Shaq kept these discoveries to himself. He wasn't ready to go public. Not yet. He returned to campus the following Tuesday under the pretense of offering a follow-up mentorship program. The administration welcomed him warmly, unaware of his true agenda. As he walked the halls, Shaq noticed something subtle but revealing. The behavior of the staff had shifted. A security guard named Harris, normally confident, avoided eye contact and fumbled his radio as Shaq passed. Shaq took note. Later, during a scheduled classroom visit, he saw Blake Harrow seated near the window, flanked by Colton Fairview. When a teacher referenced Clarence's suspension in passing, Colton smirked. Blake, however, didn't smile. He stared straight ahead, knuckles pale against his desk. During lunch, Shaq sat quietly in the faculty lounge, listening. People assumed his presence was symbolic, honorary, so they let down their guard. 2 custodians discussed how the office keycard system had glitched the night of the gala. A young administrative assistant whispered that she'd seen Blake lingering near the staff Wi-Fi router that evening. Probably just looking for a signal, she'd shrugged, but Shaq's instinct screamed otherwise. He returned to the surveillance data. Cross-referencing timestamps, he found another anomaly. A second student, Tessa Langdon, had been present during the moment the camera shut off. She wasn't part of the earlier suspect pool. Too quiet, too reserved. But Shaq didn't rule her out. He tracked her class schedule, waited until dismissal, and watched from a discreet distance as she left the building. When she passed Clarence's photo in the front lobby, her gaze lingered longer than expected. Not just a glance, something like guilt. She clutched her notebook tighter, then walked faster. That night, Shaq compiled everything he had. A wall of clues had begun to form in his mind. Clarence hadn't even entered the hall, where the ring was stolen. After a certain point, the outage was orchestrated. Students with ties to influence had been present and behaved suspiciously. One girl knew more than she let on. And security, at best negligent, at worst complicit. Still, he lacked the final thread. He knew better than to confront a system directly. Hawthorne Crest operated on reputation. Accusing a student like Colton, without airtight proof, would create deflection, not justice. So instead, he built a trap, quietly, methodically. He called Helena Whitcomb's mother, offering to personally fund a replacement ring for the one lost at the gala. She was grateful, even flattered. During the call, Shaq asked if they had insurance documentation or photos of the original ring for duplication purposes. She provided them, and with those photos, Shaq made another call to a private jeweler he trusted. What came back changed everything. The ring on display at the gala had not been the original heirloom. It had been a replica, near perfect, but with synthetic emeralds and a different clasp. The real ring had never even been at the gala. Shaq froze.
Why would Helena bring a replica unless she knew something might happen? Or worse, was she in on it?
He revisited the footage with a sharper eye. Sure enough, Helena and Blake shared a brief conversation just before the camera outage. Their exchange lasted seconds, but her fingers tapped his wrist 3 times, deliberate. A signal? An agreement? Shaq expanded his inquiry. Helena's social media posts, typically lavish and loud, had gone quiet after the gala. The timing aligned with the internal investigation. She was distancing herself. But why? Back at school, Shaq watched Colton again. The boy was cocky, but not stupid. He had started to sense eyes on him. That afternoon, he cornered one of the junior security assistants in the hallway, whispering urgently. Shaq observed from a safe distance. The assistant nodded twice, then handed Colton a thumb drive. When Colton left, Shaq followed the assistant to the maintenance corridor. He introduced himself casually, joked about how easy it was to get lost in the building. The assistant smiled nervously. Shaq leaned in, voice low. "You know Clarence didn't do it, right?" The smile vanished. The assistant didn't respond, but his silence confirmed everything. That night, Shaq organized his evidence into a clean portfolio. Not just theories, data, time-coded footage, access logs, corroborated statements. He'd tied the outage to staff access, linked Colton and Blake's behavior patterns, exposed the ring's falseness, and tracked the complicity of at least one adult. But the final piece wasn't paper, it was presence. Shaq didn't want to send a report. He wanted to say it in person, calmly, unshakably, so the truth would ring louder than the lies that had lived too long. He scheduled a return visit with the headmistress for the following Friday, under the pretense of discussing alumni donations. He brought no entourage, no press, just the truth in a binder, and Clarence's dignity in his heart. The quiet storm he had stirred was nearly ready to break. Shaq sat alone in his hotel room, surrounded by neatly organized notes and glowing screens. The portfolio he had built was strong, solid enough to question, possibly to shake, but not yet to break the wall protecting Hawthorne Crest's elite. What remained hidden were the layers beneath, the quiet rot, the secrets buried, not just in footage and files, but in the politics of silence. That was where real truth lived, and Shaq knew if he wanted to find it, he had to look deeper. He wasn't chasing a ring anymore. He was chasing a system designed to protect itself. He started with the school's security infrastructure. It looked secure on paper, updated biannually, overseen by a third-party firm, with 24/7 monitored feeds. But something about the manual override of the gala camera didn't sit right. So Shaq went back through maintenance logs and visitor access files. The trail led him to a familiar name, Victor Denham, the head of security. Denham had worked at Hawthorne Crest for nearly a decade. He was ex-military, quiet, loyal, and rarely questioned. But what raised Shaq's brow wasn't Denham's presence. It was his access. On the night of the gala, Denham's keycard had been used twice in restricted systems, once near the camera control room, and once again in the admin IT terminal, both outside his typical patrol route. Shaq reached out to a contact in cybersecurity, someone he trusted to retrieve deleted data from the school's archival backups. What came back wasn't just damning, it was revealing. In a cache of supposedly wiped logs, Shaq found an embedded file marked as a diagnostic test run days before the gala. It had been renamed, concealed under layers of system code. When decrypted, the file revealed a list, a map of blind spots in the school's surveillance system, the corners of hallways, the back service doors, even the exact timing needed to slip past the auction camera before it looped to its off sequence. It wasn't an accident. Someone had charted it. Someone had rehearsed. At the bottom of the metadata, the file's creation had been traced to a user ID belonging not to Denham, but to an assistant system administrator, Beckett Langford, a student. Shaq froze. Beckett wasn't a name on any suspect list. He was the golden boy, straight-A student, chess club captain, fluent in 2 languages, son of Douglas Langford, a real estate mogul who had helped fund the new library wing. Beckett was a fixture in the school's marketing campaigns, his face plastered across promotional brochures, clean record, perfect smile. But beneath it, Shaq sensed something colder, a calculating intelligence, a boy taught not just how to win, but how to never get caught. Digging into Beckett's digital footprint revealed more than a prodigy's curiosity. He had admin-level access to school systems, a privilege not usually granted to students. His name appeared on beta software tests, and he had worked closely with the security team on student tech initiatives. What it really meant was access without oversight. Beckett could test vulnerabilities and no one would question it. Denham had allowed it, likely at the request of Langford Sr., in exchange for continued donations, and it was through this access that the perfect crime had been orchestrated. But Shaq still lacked motive. Why would a student like Beckett engineer the theft of a ring that wasn't even real? Unless it wasn't about the ring. That's when Shaq revisited the brooch case. The one dismissed 5 years earlier. A stolen brooch during a parents' luncheon. No police report, no resolution. But the date stood out. It had happened on a day Beckett had been volunteering in the administration's tech office. Shaq made a note, then he checked for more. In the past 4 years, 3 other minor thefts had been reported, and quietly dropped. Earrings, a watch, a cufflink, all were brushed off as misplacements. All occurred during events where Beckett had system access. It wasn't coincidence. It was a pattern. A long game masked by excellence and protected by privilege. Shaq needed more than files. He needed testimony. And it came from an unlikely place. Miss Geneva, the kitchen staff member who had earlier confided in him, called again. This time she shared something she had overheard during a summer tech workshop, held in the cafeteria. Beckett had been speaking to Blake Harrow, and she remembered a phrase, "No one watches the quiet corners. That's where you make your move." It had meant little to her at the time, but now it echoed in Shaq's mind with weight and certainty. He began reconstructing the motive. Beckett wasn't stealing for money. He had plenty. This was about control. About precision. He had built a game where he could manipulate perception. And Clarence? Clarence was never the target. He was the scapegoat. The predictable fall guy whose profile fit the role the system had rehearsed for generations. One accusation, one suspicion, and the whole community fell into line. But there was another layer, and Shaq couldn't ignore it. Beckett wasn't working alone. Someone had to help him erase logs in real time. Someone with institutional authority. All paths led back to Denham. So Shaq tracked Denham's routines. He noted the man's visits to a nearby cigar lounge, his weekly calls with Langford Sr., and the subtle but telling shift in his posture whenever Shaq was near. Denham knew he was being watched, but he didn't know what Shaq knew, yet. That week, Shaq requested an informal meeting with the headmistress, under the pretense of donating funds for an integrity in education scholarship. She agreed, excited. The next morning, Shaq arrived early and placed a file on her desk, sealed, marked confidential. Inside were excerpts of the blind spot map, the camera override logs, and the names Beckett and Denham circled in red. Her smile faded. She asked him if this was an accusation. Shaq didn't flinch. He said it was a warning, and that what came next would either be her opportunity to protect her school's dignity, or to become complicit in its failure. She didn't answer. Shaq left her office, and walked the halls again, this time slower, letting the weight of what he'd uncovered settle. It wasn't just Clarence's name he was protecting. It was the story behind every assumption, every quiet cover-up, every decision made in the shadows. The missing ring had been a bait, but what had been stolen, truly, was integrity. And Shaq wasn't going to let that theft go unnoticed. In the days that followed, Beckett's behavior changed. He stopped lingering after class. His laptop was no longer seen in the tech lab. When he passed Shaq in the hallway, he didn't smile, just nodded once, a flicker of calculation still behind his eyes. Denham stopped reporting for morning briefings. The administration claimed he was on leave, but the truth was out now, even if not yet public. The headmistress called Shaq the next evening. Her voice was steadier than he expected. She told him she'd reviewed the documents, spoken with legal counsel, and launched a quiet internal inquiry. He asked her one question. Will Clarence be reinstated? Her silence said more than words. Shaq hung up and looked at the skyline from his hotel window. This wasn't justice yet, but it was movement. The web was unraveling. The blind spots were no longer hidden, and the people who had used silence as a shield were now being seen in full light. Clarence, unaware of the details but sensing a shift, had begun to hope again. The mail no longer came with silent threats. Trevin had smiled that morning. A small, crooked smile, but real. Something in the air had changed. And far beneath the surface, Shaq knew the battle wasn't over. The ring was just the beginning. There were more layers, more lies, but the codes had been cracked, the histories unburied. Now it was time to expose everything. The letter arrived on a gray Thursday, tucked between utility bills and an advertisement for a pizza chain Clarence had never once ordered from. The envelope bore the school's insignia, sharp, proud, embossed in royal blue. He knew before he even opened it. The words were predictable. A pending termination, citing the lack of resolution regarding the gala incident, and the need to maintain the academy's integrity. There was no mention of new evidence, no acknowledgement of the quiet storm Shaq had stirred, just bureaucracy doing what it did best, cutting ties under the guise of order. Clarence sat at the kitchen table, eyes fixed on the letter, but seeing none of the words. Trevin was in the other room, humming along to a math game on his tablet, unaware of how quickly the world had moved against them again. Clarence folded the letter once, precisely, and set it down beside his coffee cup. He didn't tear it, didn't curse. He just breathed. Slowly, deliberately, like a man who had learned how to take the weight of injustice without letting it crush the soul beneath it. Later that afternoon, the vandalism came, spray-painted in bright red, across his fence. Scrawled with vicious intent were the words, thief and liar. Beneath them an even uglier word, one that had followed Clarence in whispers for decades. This time writ bold across the wood he'd painted with his own hands last summer. Neighbors pretended they hadn't seen. The mailman skipped his usual wave. By sunset, someone had posted a blurry photo of the graffiti on social media, tagging the school and demanding accountability, not for Clarence but from him. Trevin saw it as he came outside to water the plants. His small hands froze around the watering can, his eyes wide, mouth parted but silent. Clarence stepped forward gently and took the can from him. He didn't say a word, just held Trevin close, shielding him from the letters even as the meaning had already sunk in. That night, the boy cried, not loudly, not with tantrums, but with quiet tears that soaked Clarence's shirt and said more than any scream ever could. Across town, in the quiet of his hotel room, Shaq stared at his reflection. The mirror showed a man the world called a giant, a champion, a celebrity. But in that moment, what he saw was a boy again. A memory he rarely visited surfaced uninvited. A night outside a Louisiana diner, when he was 16, watching his father diffuse a situation with quiet strength while being called things no man should hear. Shaq had stood there, fists clenched, heart pounding, knowing that even his size couldn't change the color of his skin. Fame hadn't erased that feeling. He just layered it under interviews and endorsement. He thought of Clarence, not just suspended, not just accused, but now vilified. A man who had done nothing but show up and serve, and now they were preparing to fire him, to erase him from the school's history, like a clerical correction. Shaq had done his work in the shadows. He had pulled strings, uncovered lies, built a case of truth stronger than steel. But the board wasn't moving fast enough, and now a child had cried himself to sleep, because of a lie grown bold enough to paint across a family's home. That was the breaking point. Shaq rose from his seat and picked up the folder he had shown the headmistress. This time he wasn't taking it to a quiet meeting. He was going to the school board itself. He didn't call ahead, didn't wait for an invitation. He walked through the school's front entrance during the early evening board session, and requested 10 minutes of their time. When the receptionist hesitated, He simply stood there, tall, composed, undeniable. 10 minutes later, he was ushered into a wood-paneled room, where 5 members of the board sat, flanked by legal counsel and administrative assistants. Some faces he recognized, names from the donor walls, people who shook hands for photo ops and then vanished when it was time to clean up their own messes. Shaq placed the folder on the table, opened it, and spoke. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't appeal to emotion. He simply laid out the facts, the falsified camera outages, the backdoor access to security software, the misdirection involving the replica ring, the metadata traced back to Beckett Langford, the enabling silence of Victor Denham, the whispered threats, the repeat thefts buried under administrative carpet. It wasn't a plea, it was a reckoning. And then he paused, looked at each board member, and said clearly, "You were about to fire a man who has served this school longer than most of you have been seated here, without proof, without process, because it was easy." Silence met him. Some looked away, others shuffled papers, but Shaq kept going. He told them about Trevin, about the vandalism, about the weight of legacy that doesn't end when school lets out. He didn't ask them to feel sorry. He asked them to act. When he finished, he left the folder open and walked out. That night, the board convened privately, and for the first time, they didn't discuss donations or gala seating charts. They reviewed evidence, cross-examined logs. Some resisted, but the tide had turned. Denham was contacted and asked for a formal statement. He resigned the next morning. Beckett Langford was pulled from class and questioned. His parents were notified, furious, defensive, and cornered. Clarence received a call that same afternoon. The headmistress's voice was softer this time. She informed him that his suspension had been lifted, that a full review had cleared him of wrongdoing, that the board had issued a formal apology and would be mailing an official statement for his records. She tried to explain more, but Clarence simply thanked her and hung up. He stepped onto his porch and looked at the graffiti still staining the fence. The words hadn't vanished, and they probably wouldn't for a while. But inside the house, Trevin sat at the table, pencil in hand, doing homework with a confidence he hadn't shown in weeks, and that meant more than any letter. Shaq returned to the school the next day, not for a meeting, but for a walk. He passed students who now looked at him differently, staff who whispered with a new kind of reverence. He entered Clarence's old workspace and found the nameplate had been returned, this time polished even brighter. That afternoon, Clarence arrived quietly, holding a lunch pail and a thermos. He walked through the halls without fanfare. But every step was a victory. The ties that had been stretched frayed, nearly broken. Some snapped completely. Trust once lost didn't return with policy. But something had shifted. The school would not go back to what it was before, and neither would Shaq. He stood near the entrance, watching Clarence work, just as he had the night of the gala. But this time, there was no suspicion in the air. Just quiet restoration, and the echo of a truth that couldn't be painted over, whispered away, or filed into silence ever again. The corridors of Hawthorne Crest carried a strange silence in the days following Clarence's reinstatement. Not relief, not resolution, just a suspension of breath, as if the walls themselves knew that something deeper remained unearthed. The public apology had been issued, the suspension lifted, the vandalism painted over. But Shaq knew it wasn't finished, not yet, because beneath the formalities, the heart of the injustice still beat quietly in the shadows. The ring was never recovered. The lies had not been named, and those responsible had not been held to the light. So Shaq proposed something simple, a quiet inspection of student lockers. He didn't approach the board this time. He went directly to the head of student security, the interim replacement for Victor Denham, and suggested a protocol check. Officially, it would be presented as a response to multiple reports of petty theft over the past school year. A random sweep, neutral and non-invasive. The headmistress approved it, reluctantly but without resistance. She understood that something unfinished still lingered, and perhaps deep down she hoped it would reveal what everyone feared but wouldn't admit. The inspection was scheduled for a Friday afternoon. Students were told to leave campus early, due to a scheduled sanitation drill. Staff remained behind, and Shaq walked the halls with the new security team, clipboard in hand, demeanor calm. It wasn't about catching anyone red-handed. It was about finishing the story with facts instead of assumptions. They moved locker by locker, documenting only what was relevant: electronics, contraband, anything unregistered. Most were clean. Some had minor violations. Nothing serious, until they reached locker 3. The name on the door, Paxton Granger. Shaq remembered him well. A secondary player in Beckett Langford's circle. Not loud, not overtly cruel, but always close to the action. The kind who laughed at the wrong moments, who didn't light the match but always stood near the flame. His father, Julian Granger, sat on the school's finance committee and owned a chain of upscale dealerships across 3 states. Paxton, by every measure, had been raised with everything except accountability. The locker was opened, and there it was. Inside, buried beneath textbooks and a crumpled varsity jacket, lay a small velvet-lined box. The ring. Helena Whitcomb's diamond ring, intact, unmistakable, and unmistakably out of place. Shaq picked it up carefully and handed it to the security lead, who froze. But that wasn't all. Beside the ring were several other items. A vintage watch reported missing during homecoming. A brooch last seen at the winter banquet. A gold money clip engraved with initials from a guest at the alumni dinner. None of them belonged in Paxton's locker. And yet here they were, trophies hidden in plain sight. Shaq knew what he was seeing. Not theft for profit, not desperation, but something darker. A pattern. A game. And then he found the note, folded inside a small red journal tucked behind a stack of papers. A handwritten note fell out and landed at Shaq's feet. He picked it up and unfolded it slowly, reading the words not with surprise but with grim recognition. Let's see how many times we can pin it on Clarence before someone notices. Whoever does it cleanest buys dinner. Bonus points if the staff apologizes to us. The words were scribbled in the kind of handwriting only privileged cruelty could afford. Messy, arrogant, certain of immunity. It wasn't dated, but it didn't need to be. The message was clear. This had never been about a ring. It had been about control, about amusement, about framing a man who they believed would never fight back. Shaq closed the locker, sealing its contents, and asked the security lead to document everything but disclose nothing yet. The team agreed. Quiet professionalism held strong that afternoon. No names were leaked. No gossip spread. But attention began humming beneath the school's foundation. Low and urgent. Something fundamental had cracked open. That evening, Shaq sat in his car, outside the school for a long time. The folder beside him was thicker now. Not just evidence but confession. Not just suspicion, but proof. And yet, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops of Hawthorne Crest, he understood something deeper. The hardest part wasn't uncovering the truth. It was exposing it. He couldn't simply call a press conference and read the note. The school would spin, the families would deny, lawyers would arrive, and Clarence, already scarred by false judgment, might be forced through another public storm. This time, Shaq needed precision. He needed a stage where the truth couldn't be deflected, where the community would have no choice but to listen, to face what had festered behind polished reputation. So he made a plan. It began with the headmistress. He met her in her office the next morning, placing the recovered items and the note on her desk without ceremony. Her face paled as she read the message, lips pressed thin. For a moment she didn't speak. Then, slowly, she reached for her phone. But Shaq stopped her with a raised hand. "There's a better way," he said. Calm, measured, absolute. He proposed a school-wide assembly, a gathering meant to reinforce community values. She agreed, hesitantly, knowing full well the gravity of what he intended to do. Invitations were sent. Parents, students, faculty, all expected to attend. No details given. Just a date, a time and a speaker. Shaquille O'Neal. As preparations were made, whispers began. Why another assembly? What would he say? But no one knew the truth, except a few. The school board was briefed, barely, just enough to keep them present and nervous. Clarence wasn't told the full story, only that he'd been asked to attend. He agreed, curious but cautious. He arrived quietly, wearing his pressed brown suit and carrying the same thermos he always had. Shaq met him at the entrance, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. "Trust me," he said simply. The gymnasium, filled that afternoon. Rows of folding chairs, the air tight with anticipation. Students murmured. Parents checked their watches. Faculty adjusted their posture, and then Shaq stepped onto the stage. He didn't begin with accusations. He began with a story. He spoke of his own youth, of the silence he learned to live with, of the assumptions made when he walked into rooms, of the nights spent wondering why truth had to fight so hard to be heard. And then he spoke of Clarence, without naming names at first. A man of dignity, of service, of undeserved shame. And finally he revealed the ring, the note, the locker. The room shifted. Gasps. Murmurs. The sound of breath being caught. He held up the paper and read the words aloud, slowly, letting them hang like fog. And then he did something no one expected. He handed the microphone to Clarence. Clarence didn't prepare a speech. He didn't raise his voice. He just told the truth of how it felt to be erased. How the hardest part wasn't the accusation, but the silence that followed. How the people he'd served with kindness chose doubt over loyalty. How his grandson asked him if the world would always see him that way. When he finished, there were no cheers. Just silence. But it was a different kind now. Not avoidance. Not discomfort. Just truth. Sitting in every chair. After the assembly, Beckett Langford, Paxton Granger, and Blake Harrow were removed from campus under administrative leave. Their families protested, but the proof was irrefutable. The headmistress issued a statement. The board released a formal apology. Again, but this time, it wasn't buried in jargon. This time, it carried weight. Shaq watched it all from a distance. He hadn't saved Clarence. Clarence had never needed saving. What he had done was refuse to let lies settle as a legacy. The lockers had been opened. But more than that, so had the eyes that for too long had chosen not to see. The invitation came quietly. No fanfare. Just a simple email from the headmistress's office titled, Special Guest Assembly, Mandatory Attendance. Students murmured in the hallways about it, wondering if it was another talk on responsibility, leadership, or college preparation. No details were provided, and in a school now rife with whispers, the lack of information only deepened the tension. Teachers lined their lessons to end just before noon. Custodians arranged folding chairs in the gymnasium with extra rows, and tech staff checked the microphones 3 times. The name listed on the internal schedule for the afternoon speaker was familiar, but no one quite knew what to expect from Shaquille O'Neal this time. Shaq arrived early, dressed not in a tailored suit, but in a simple black sweater and jeans. No media crew, no security detail, just him, carrying a single folder under one arm, and a stillness in his eyes that suggested this visit was not just another stop in a long career of inspiration. The faculty greeted him warmly, though uneasily. Some hoped for healing, others feared what might be stirred. A few clung to the idea that maybe, just maybe, the drama had already passed. Clarence Miles received the same invitation. No explanation, no context, just a message from the headmistress's assistant. We'd be honored if you could attend. He didn't ask questions. He arrived 5 minutes before the first bell rang, taking a seat in the last row, away from the light, hat in hand, suit pressed to near perfection. Trevin sat beside him, legs swinging over the edge of his chair, unaware of what was to come. As the room filled, a hush began to fall. Students filed in, phones tucked into pockets, sensing that something about this felt different. The stage was bare, except for a wooden podium and one microphone. At exactly 12:30, the headmistress stepped onto the platform, thanked everyone for attending, and introduced Shaquille O'Neal as a mentor, athlete, and advocate for truth. The applause was polite but subdued. Curiosity hung thick in the air. Shaq stepped forward slowly, the weight of silence wrapping around him. He began as expected. He spoke about leadership, about legacy, about how every student in the room had the power to shape their story through choice, character, and conviction. He told them about failure, about resilience, about his early years being misunderstood. The crowd leaned in. They listened. They were prepared for inspiration. But then his voice shifted. He paused, looked out across the sea of faces, and began again, slower, quieter, but with unmistakable purpose. I want to tell you a different kind of story, he said, voice steady, one that happened right here, in this building. A story about what it means when we don't speak up, when we let assumptions do the work of truth. The gym stiffened. Teachers glanced at one another. Students sat straighter. Shaq opened the folder he had carried with him. He removed a single sheet of paper and read aloud the note found in Paxton Granger's locker. Let's see how many times we can pin it on Clarence before someone notices. Whoever does it cleanest buys dinner. Bonus points if the staff apologizes to us. There was no reaction at first. Just breath held so tightly, it could have cracked glass. And then, like the turning of a tide, A ripple spread through the room. Gasps, furtive glances, faces flushed. Silence cracked open into something heavier. Shaq didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. That's what someone wrote about a man who has served this school with more honor than many people here have ever acknowledged, he continued, eyes scanning the audience. Clarence Miles was falsely accused. Not because he made a mistake, but because someone believed no one would care if he took the blame. He held up the ring, polished, unmistakable. Then the photos of other stolen items. Finally, the scanned blind spot camera maps from the security files. Each piece laid out in sequence. Each lie unpacked with surgical precision. You didn't lose a ring, he said. You lost something far more important, integrity. And you did it in front of your classmates, your faculty, and your community. In the back row, Clarence's eyes didn't widen. He didn't flinch, but his hands tightened around his hat. Trevin looked up at him, confused, then watched as heads began to turn in their direction. Some apologetic, some ashamed. Shaq stepped away from the podium and walked the edge of the stage. His voice lowered, more personal now. I've been called a lot of things in my life, he said. Champion, giant, leader. But I've also been called things that never made it into the highlight reel. Names that stung. Assumptions that weighed. And I'm telling you right now, silence is not neutrality. Silence is a choice. He pointed gently toward Clarence without calling him out by name. That man was humiliated. Not by one person, but by the system around him, by the laughter that didn't stop it, by the teachers who said nothing, by the students who looked the other way. And now you have a choice. What kind of people do you want to be? The gym was still, the kind of stillness where truth had filled every inch of air, heavy and undeniable. Shaq nodded once, handed the folder to the headmistress, and stepped down from the stage. He didn't wait for applause. There was none. Just a long, weighty quiet. Clarence stood slowly. Trevin followed. For the first time in weeks, the people who had avoided his eyes now looked up and didn't look away. Some rose. A few teachers approached him, some with tears in their eyes, others fumbling for words they should have spoken sooner. Outside, the sun had risen higher. Shaq walked with Clarence across the campus, both men side by side, no words exchanged. There was no need. Justice doesn't always come with noise. Sometimes it comes in the form of clarity. Exposure, the removal of masks. That day, the students of Hawthorne Crest didn't go home talking about rings or fame, or even the scandal itself. They talked about accountability, and for Clarence Miles, it wasn't about being vindicated. It was about finally being seen, not as a janitor, not as a suspect, but as a man who had stood tall while the world tried to make him small. The Monday following the assembly dawned with a strange stillness across Hawthorne Crest Academy. It wasn't the quiet of peace, but the quiet of consequence, of truths finally unearthed, and the dust just beginning to settle. The echoes of Shaq's speech and Clarence's silent strength still pulsed through the hallways. No one spoke openly of what had been revealed, but the mood was unmistakable. The school no longer looked away. By noon, the email started going out. First came the announcement that Paxton Granger and Beckett Langford had been formally expelled, effective immediately. The message was terse, carefully worded, and sent to parents and staff simultaneously. Violations of school ethics, it read, compromising student trust and institutional integrity. It never specified the ring, the note, or the hidden items in the locker, but everyone knew. Names once spoken with envy or admiration were now discussed only behind closed doors, in whispers edged with shock and unease. The fallout reached beyond campus quickly. Local news stations picked up the story within hours. At first, the reports focused on the anonymous ring scandal and the heroism of a former NBA star. But within days, the names leaked. Beckett's father, Douglas Langford, issued a stiff press statement calling the school's action hasty and politically motivated, vowing legal response. But in private, donors began pulling away. Public pressure mounted. His influence, once untouchable, now showed its cracks. Julian Granger, Paxton's father, took a different route. In a carefully choreographed interview, he expressed deep regret for his son's actions. "We failed as parents," he said, emotion rehearsed but palpable. "We raised a child with privilege, but without principle." It didn't save his son from the damage, but it bought him temporary grace in the eyes of a public hungry for atonement. Inside the school, the resignation of Victor Denham landed with a quiet finality. A brief letter posted on the faculty board read simply, "Effective immediately. I am stepping down from my position as head of security. I take full responsibility for the oversight under my watch." No one challenged it. No one needed to. His absence was both symbolic and practical, an admission that the system had failed, and that it had done so under his watch. But amid all the noise, the press, the shifting allegiances, Clarence Miles remained silent. He returned to campus only once more, at the request of the headmistress. She greeted him in the front office with a hesitant smile, a manila envelope in hand. It contained a formal letter of apology from the school board, along with an offer, a lifetime position with full retirement benefits, recognition in the school's service records, and an invitation to speak at next year's graduation. Clarence listened quietly. When she finished, he thanked her for the apology. He accepted it, but not the job. "I believe in closure," he said simply, "not in looping back into places that had to be forced to see me." He left the envelope on the table. Then he shook her hand, turned and walked down the same hallway he had once cleaned each morning, this time with nothing to carry but his pride. The same students who once averted their eyes, now parted like water as he passed. A few murmured soft apologies. One girl whispered, "I'm sorry, Mr. Miles." He nodded but didn't stop. His shoes echoed louder than they ever had. That night, Clarence sat on his porch, Trevin curled up beside him with a book. The air was warm. The fence, once vandalized, had been sanded and repainted by volunteer students, who came without being asked. Neighbors had brought food. The mailbox overflowed, not with suspicion but with handwritten letters from students, staff and even strangers from nearby towns. Words like respect, inspiration, and thank you filled page after page. But Clarence didn't need any of it. He had always known who he was. The difference now was, so did everyone else. Across town, in the office of a local nonprofit, Shaq signed a new set of documents. The scholarship was official. The Clarence Miles Honor Grant, designed for students pursuing education and community service, with priority given to children raised by single guardians or grandparents. The fund would cover tuition, books, and mentorship opportunities. It would launch with full funding from Shaq's foundation and include a permanent plaque in the school's newly renovated library wing. The idea wasn't just to honor Clarence. It was to build something enduring from what had been nearly destroyed. When Clarence was told, he didn't say much. Just smiled. A full, peaceful smile. The kind that didn't ask for celebration. The kind that had waited a long time to exhale. Shaq visited one last time before leaving town. They sat on the porch as twilight approached, the hum of insects filling the spaces between their words. Shaq didn't offer advice. Clarence didn't offer thanks. What passed between them didn't need language. Just shared understanding, the kind forged in fires others couldn't see. "I never needed the world to change," Clarence finally said, sipping from his thermos. "Just needed it to tell the truth." Shaq nodded. "And now it has." Behind them, Trevin played in the yard. The world hadn't fixed itself, but it had shifted. And for once that was enough. The last of the boxes had been taped shut by noon. Trevin sat cross-legged on the living room floor, sketching birds he saw outside the screen door, unaware or perhaps unfazed by the fact that their lives were being gently uprooted. Clarence moved through the house slowly, wiping down counters, folding towels with a kind of quiet reverence. It wasn't grief. It wasn't triumph. It was closure, the rare kind that doesn't come with applause, just stillness. The new town sat an hour outside the city, nestled between tree-lined roads and meadows that smelled like wild mint after rain. Their home was smaller but cozier, with a porch that wrapped around like an arm. The neighborhood was unremarkable. No banners, no whispers, no memories of a ring or a rumor. It was exactly what Clarence needed, not to disappear, but to breathe. Their first morning there, Clarence walked Trevin to school, hand in hand. No one stared. No one flinched. Teachers greeted them with easy smiles. Clarence nodded back, a quiet understanding behind his eyes. He wasn't looking for perfection, just space to live without suspicion, shadowing every step. Back at Hawthorne Crest, the semester wound down in its usual rhythm. Exams, locker cleanouts, yearbook signatures scrawled in hallways. But something in the air was different. The school had been changed. Not loudly, not visibly, but in the soft ways that matter most. Students looked a little longer at each other before speaking. Teachers paused before assuming. The silence that once smothered had begun to fracture. One evening, after the halls had emptied, Shaq returned to the school for a final walk. He moved slowly, his footsteps echoing through corridors still bearing his name on plaques and photos. But tonight, he wasn't a guest. He was a witness. The banners hung as they always had. The championship trophies still gleamed in the glass case. But the heart of the place, its soul felt exposed, raw in the aftermath of what had come to light. He passed the janitor's closet, now repainted, shelves neatly organized. The nameplate read, "Facilities Team," but Clarence's touch was still there in the placement of supplies, the smell of lavender cleaner he'd always preferred. Shaq lingered a moment, then kept walking. He reached the auditorium and stepped inside. Rows of chairs faced the stage, empty and still. The room that had once held a silent reckoning now sat quiet again, but not hollow. Something had been spoken there, truth at long last, and the echo of it still clung to the rafters. Shaq sat in the front row. He thought of Clarence not just as a man wronged, but as a mirror, a reflection of every person who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, judged on sight. He thought of his own moments on courts, in boardrooms, at airports, when eyes narrowed not in admiration but suspicion. He had learned to navigate it, to outgrow it, to dominate despite it. But Clarence had endured it, quietly, for decades, and never once let it turn him bitter. Justice wasn't just about proving someone wrong. It was about rebuilding what had been torn down. Not all wounds could be fixed, but truth, when finally spoken, had a way of stitching what mattered most. Outside, the sun had dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Shaq stood and walked to the main exit. Before leaving, he turned once more to look at the hallway behind him. Empty. Clean. Honest. For the first time in a long while. A week later, a package arrived at Clarence's new home. No return address. Inside was a small, carved plaque. On it were the words, "Truth doesn't shout. It waits. And when it speaks, it does not ask for permission." Below that, simply, "Thank you, Mr. Miles." Clarence placed it on the mantel beside Evelyn's photo. Trevin asked what it meant. "It means," Clarence said, "sometimes silence holds the truth until someone's ready to hear it." That evening, they sat on the porch, stars blinking into view. The breeze was soft. The world, finally, was quiet. And somewhere far behind them, the long shadow of injustice had finally begun to recede. Not because it had disappeared, but because someone had stood tall enough to cast light against it. If this story stirred something in you, pause before you scroll. Look closer next time. Silence surrounds injustice. The smallest voice, the quietest truth, can shift the loudest lies. And remember, sometimes the real heroes wear no jersey, carry no spotlight, but carry the weight of the world anyway. Stick with us because stories like this don't just entertain, they awaken.